So welcome to week 7 of Politics, Power and Resistance. Today we have a perspective lecture. I've just put the instructions for Menti on the screen as usual, but we're not going to be using that too much today because there's a lot less from me, as I hope you're going to be very pleased to hear, and a lot more from our guest. And I'm going to introduce her in a minute. So just to introduce the session for today. So this week, as I said, is a perspective week, which means it's a kind of a case study week, and it links to the topic that we were looking at last week when we were looking at stigma power in relation specifically to questions of poverty. And in that lecture, I gave you an overview of the kind of political and economic context for austerity and the cuts to social welfare, which have driven more and more people into poverty. And this week, we're going to be hearing a lot more about what ordinary people can do to resist this. Now, before I say more about this, let me acknowledge that today I'm on Gadigal country, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of the Gadigal people, past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, in thinking about our theme for today, which is, as I said, anti-poverty activism, I often think about the role that poverty plays in colonization. Poverty, obviously, is not something that's endemic. In other words, it's not something that's natural for any given community. It's created, as we saw last week, through the domination of the many by the few. Australia, a convict colony, which was ostensibly birthed in poverty. So as we heard last week, there's a lot of the history of the original settlers of the land and what their background was. Obviously, coming here enriched those who were brought here first and people who later on came either by choice or by force. And this happens through the impoverishment of Aboriginal people's lands and cultures. So we should remember that everything that we enjoy here is because of this original theft. So as we think about the effects of poverty on people from all walks of life, we also have to consider the relationship between wealth, poverty, and coloniality. So you're seeing already there some of the links to themes that we've been dealing with in previous weeks as we've come through the semester so far. So before I hand the floor over, I'd like to introduce our guest. I'm really excited to welcome Kristin O'Connell, and I'm sure she's going to say a little bit more about herself very soon. But Kristin O'Connell, just to say a couple of words about her bio, and Kristin, you can probably put your camera on if you'd like to. So just a few things I'm sure you can add and tell us a little bit more, but the official bio is that you're an anti-poverty activist living on the disability support pension. She's an unemployed worker at the Antipoverty Centre and the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, which provides peer support, rights information and representation for people in the social security system. And she campaigns publicly, some of you might have seen her on television recently, for the rights of everyone who relies on income support to live. So we've decided that Kristin will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. So I'm going to stop my screen share. I don't know if you have any slides, Kristin.
No, I decided against slides. My stats are kind of spread throughout. So I thought it would be better just to keep it on focus. I'm sorry about the light and arrangement as well. It's not my usual location. So thank you.
You look fine. You look very good. I'm going to put you on speaker so that we can hear directly from you. And then we'll have some time for questions towards the end, okay?
Awesome. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can.
Great. Yes, I'm just, for folks who don't know, I'm autistic, and so I notice very minor details that are very, very distracting for me, and I don't realize necessarily that they're not as bad for others. So thank you again, Alana, for having me and for that introduction. And thank you specifically for the things you highlighted there. I think it's really important to note that for tens of thousands of years prior to colonisation, there was a sustainable and egalitarian economy on this continent that's been totally dismantled and violently dismantled. So I'm joining today from unceded Wurundjeri country. I pay respect to Wurundjeri elders and also to the Gadigal elders where I normally live and work, past and present, and I extend this to elders across the continent and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folks in the class. The extreme harms caused by invasion, as you all I think are quite aware, are really still being felt today by First Peoples, and we do see the effects of this in higher rates of poverty, higher rates of incarceration, disability, unemployment than the rest of the population. So colonisation is an active and ongoing process, but the governments are perpetuating that through complex barriers to work. And they're caused by the intersections of dispossession, racism and disability, but they're also using Black communities to run the most brutal social security experiments. So there's an awful lot going on with colonisation and the way it is, the social security inflicts some of these policies more directly on Black folks than perhaps other parts of the way our economy is structured. So yes, do bear with me. I'm a little bit unwell at the moment. I haven't really slept, so hopefully I'll be coherent. I want to welcome everyone and thank you for coming. We're going to talk today about exercising agency within and against the poverty machine, and which is the way that I refer to our welfare system, which at the moment is not doing an awful lot for people's welfare. So before we start, I did want to just get a poll. So I'm going to ask you all to answer two very easy polls while we're here today. And again, I am not working on my normal system, so I'm going to try this. See if I can put the chat in here while I introduce myself. These are super easy. Everyone. It's not working.
Sorry, you want to create a poll with using the Zoom system?
Oh, no, I don't need to create one. I already created one. I just needed to get the chat to work. So I've done that now.
Oh,
so while I introduce myself, if you guys want to really quickly just indicate your understanding of or your experience of the welfare system, and it's totally anonymous, so you can say whatever you like and you can click more than one option. So as Alana mentioned, I'm an anti-poverty activist and I live on the disability support pension. Last year, we established the Antipoverty Centre and because we're experts, and we're experts because our lives are dictated by the systems that we're living in. So I'm coming at this from the position of a person who also grew up in a household that spent a lot of my childhood in poverty with my mum as a single mum, depending on Centrelink payments to keep us going. So I don't have a degree because disability and poverty got in the way of that, and I've tried multiple times and never succeeded, and I think I'm a bit past it now. I don't think I'll be going back. I've had a lot of really awful health outcomes as a result of this idea that you're only a valuable contributor to society if you're in paid employment. And that had catastrophic consequences for me for about 20 years of my life. And it's only been relatively recently that I've had, great experience of diagnosis of my various health conditions, been able to access the disability support pension and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which some of you might have heard of. And if you haven't, just pop a question in the chat, I'll explain that. And that has meant I've been able to better maintain my well-being. So funnily enough, the fact that I'm able to do the work that I do now, that I'm able to be here speaking to you today, is proof that giving support to people actually works, funnily enough. So I'm one of the lucky few who gets both DSP and NDIS. It's a very small number of disabled people in that situation. But the payments are still so low that I actually rely on charity to survive. So hopefully now you've all had a minute to do that poll. I'm just going to quickly check in. And you should all be able to see the results, I think, as well. All right, so nearly half of you have not grown up in a household on a Centrelink payment nor been on a Centrelink payment yourselves. That's really amazing. It's hard for some of us to even imagine that. And we've got about a third of people have had mutual obligations activities, which hopefully most of you are familiar. Some of the very pointless tasks that the government forces you to do to receive an unemployment payment. It's a little bit different to a student payment, which has different requirements, and aside from your study, much lower requirements. And we've got nearly a third who grew up in a household that relied on Centrelink. So thanks so much for sharing that, folks. It helps me realise what sort of context I need to give you. And I'm just going to add another one in here now that I was going to do a bit later, but it'll save me from messing around with this system if I do it now. So see how I go with that. Alrighty, so this one's just about your thoughts on why people don't work or don't have a job. There's 4 options, and basically you can just drag and drop them into the order that you think is kind of most likely reasons why people don't work to least likely reasons why people don't work. Cool. And so while folks doing that, I'll just give a slightly more background on the Antipoverty Centre. As I said, we were established about a year ago, and we wanted to counter those problems with academics and think tanks and other people in the political class and the media class contributing to harmful decisions on behalf of people that they purport to represent. So we are trying to challenge accepted wisdom about who can. Is that someone jumping in with a question? Pallavi, maybe.
Can everybody just mute themselves, please? Because if I mute everybody, I'll mute Kristin as well. So if you're not on mute, just mute yourself. Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's okay, no stress. So yeah, we want, we want to see accepted women kind of wisdom challenged about who can actually contribute to debate, right? Like I said, I don't have a degree. I live on payments. I grew up on payments. Lots of people have a lot of really intelligent things to say, but have no avenue to be able to say those things and put those ideas forward. So we're kind of wanting to ask the people who already have that access, who are doing paid work, most of whom do paid work in this space, to dramatically reorient and to say, institutions should become more cooperative and more inclusive of those of us who are in these systems and living in poverty. And so the fact that I'm here today is an example of how that can work, and how, people like Alana are taking responsibility for expanding this idea of who actually gets to have a say. So we defend and fight for the rights of people like ourselves who experience violence at the hands of an economic system that is actively designed to oppress us. And we want to shift how people speak about and respond to poverty, and ensure that those voices and rights of people in poverty are at the centre of social policy development. There should not be any decisions made about us without us, and that's a pretty straightforward concept for lots of discussions that we have about people who are marginalised in different ways, but it doesn't seem to be, we're not there yet when it comes to poverty. So in this session, I've got a lot I wanted to try and get through. It's very ambitious, so I might have to skip some bits, but the idea is that we'll give you a little bit of context of the system, some statistics about who is in it, talk a little bit about why it operates the way it does, and who is benefiting from the system the way that it currently exists, and then move into a section about, more explicitly about power, and about where it comes from, who's using it, how they're using it. And then finally talk about some of the ways that we're actually taking our power, how we're using it in the ways that we plan and hope to use it to actually start to dismantle some of these problems, and to essentially to make the things that are happening now untenable for the people who make the decisions about it at the moment. So like I said, it's a huge amount of stuff. I'll do my best, and hopefully we should have time for questions. So we'll get into some more detail at that time. I'm just going to quickly check in and see what we thought about why people don't work. Oh, I've got to find my link for that. Okay. Alrighty, that's great, guys. So we did have the 86% of people, or 86% score. I don't quite know how the scoring works. The top result was there are no available jobs. And it's good to know that even though lots of you haven't been in the welfare system, that you have a pretty good sense as to how people do end up there. And then the second most popular choice was that people can't do the available jobs. And I guess last week you got a lot of context on that. So that makes a lot of sense, that you have a good understanding of that. Lots of people are too busy. There's heaps of unpaid work going on, and very few people don't want a job. And even that kind of framing, and I did do it on purpose, is to try and kind of unpick the idea that, like, wanting a job is in itself something that means you're worthwhile, because although we don't always identify it, the idea that someone doesn't want a job, you know, it's a complex one, right? If someone doesn't want a job, it may actually be because there are other things going on in their life that they don't link themselves to their lack of interest in finding paid work, and that we all have different ways we contribute to our society and community, and that lots of people don't recognize the work that they're already doing to build those communities up. So we have this like complex tension too, even just in the idea of someone not wanting a job. Okay, so thank you very much for participating in those. So as I said, I did want to throw some statistics at you. I know this is probably not a class full of folks who do a lot with statistics, and I do have these in a nice detailed document that I can share with Alana to circulate later. But just some key ones I wanted to highlight. There are obviously a lot of people who, probably in this course as well, who are working and are on a Centrelink payment that's half the poverty line or even lower for those of you who are on youth allowance, who then have those mutual obligations activities, which I'll talk a bit more about later, plus work and study and family commitments. So there's an awful lot going on for people, and trying to manage all that whilst also not having enough money to live. You've probably seen a lot of headlines about the extraordinary unemployment rate and the fact that we're down to 4%. But that's a very misleading figure. So the last time the unemployment rate was 4% was in 2008. And at that time, just over 3% of the working age population, that's people 15 to 64, was on an unemployment payment. That's now nearly doubled. So although the unemployment rate looks great, the actual proportion of people relying on these poverty payments is nearly double what it was back in 2008. There are about 23 people who have been on an unemployment payment for longer than a year for each entry-level job that was advertised in February. So when you identified there aren't jobs, and that's true because there's a whole lot of jobs being advertised, but they're for executives and people who earn a lot of money and have very specific qualifications. Of course, we would expect there are probably an awful lot of jobs going in the healthcare sector right now, but you can't just magically get into the health sector. So we've seen over the pandemic about a 41% increase in the number of people who've been on income support for longer than a year. So yeah, and I think I've just seen a question in the chat. I'm just going to quickly check in on that one because it'd be great to keep track of you as you go. Who wants to work in retail if they weren't forced to live on wage labour? I mean, true, but if we weren't forced to live on wage labour, the things we need from retail might actually create the conditions of jobs that actually were good, right? A lot of people, and actually I speak to someone who I've provided support to in the past, who is really proud of the fact that she's worked in hospitality and retail. She wants to live in a place and in a society where that's a sustainable career for her, rather than something that she's trapped in just out of school because she doesn't want to go and study at university. That's not what she's interested in. She would like a sustainable job in retail, helping people get stuff that they want. So it's how we think about what a good job is as well. A good job shouldn't be one where you feel like you're a bit elite and above other people and you've got super special and important skills that took a lot of time and study. Not that it's not incredibly valuable to get, but a job where you can afford to live, feel comfortable and confident about your future, and enjoy your day-to-day interactions with people. And that's all she wants. And she's, been 7 years out of high school now and struggling in just the most low-paid, insecure jobs where she's treated with abuse. And if we didn't have to rely on wage labour and she was doing that work without as much kind of punitive control over her life, it'd be a lot harder for customers to get away with abusing her, right? Because those customers wouldn't have anywhere to go because that wouldn't be tolerated, that sort of behaviour. So I'm going to skip through some of the other stats I had for you, but 20% of people who are on an unemployment payment are employed. They just don't earn enough to get off the unemployment payment, which means they're not above the poverty line. When we talk about the poverty line, about a third of people who were on these payments in 2020, when they were lifted up to the Henderson poverty line, still were regularly skipping meals, and 40% of people still couldn't cover medical and healthcare costs. And there's complex interactions there with disability and the extra costs of disability and the number of disabled people who are on payments which is in the hundreds of thousands. We're talking between 30 and 50% of people, depending on how you measure it. It's extraordinarily high, the number of disabled people on unemployment payments. And so even when you got to that level of the poverty line as it currently exists, people couldn't afford to actually survive properly in a way that we would consider to be adequate. So when we talk about the poverty line, we're saying, yes, we need all payments. This is what some of the work we do. All payments should be immediately lifted to the Henderson poverty line, but that's actually not enough, because we do need to do some work to have a better and a more sophisticated understanding of poverty in Australia in 2022. The Henderson poverty line that we use was created in the 60s and early 70s. It's a little bit out of date. We didn't have internet and mobile phones and home computers then. So there's a lot of things it doesn't take into account. So yeah, that's the best we have at the moment. People still can't afford to live on it, and we need to do more work in that front. The other thing I just want to say on payment levels is they do trap people in unsafe homes. So people think a lot about, well, you know, maybe you can get away with not eating, but how often are people being trapped in abusive households? Very often, particularly for queer and trans folks who are younger people who can't get out of their family home, and of course people who are in violent relationships and who can't afford to leave. And so you know, 13% of women who left a violent partner, I think this stats from 2019, returned to their violent partner because they didn't have enough money. Women who were between the age of 21 and 28 years old who were in financial hardship were more than 3 times as likely to report severe partner abuse. And 60,000 women aged 15 to 24 who experienced violence in 2019 also experienced moderate to very high levels of financial hardship. So you can see that interaction between poverty and so many things, but particularly in violent relationships. So there's huge support for job seeker increase as well. I'll share those stats with you later, but it's extraordinary. So despite the fact that we have this thing that I'm about to talk about called the dole bludger myth, we still have a really large number of people wanting people out of poverty, because people in this country are actually not brutal monsters like our government. So the government has gotten away with brutalizing people because its propaganda is successful. Many people on payments themselves actually buy into this thing called the dole bludger myth, where they think that their enemies are other poor people and not the people who are keeping us in poverty. It's, you know, that mentality of like, there must be all of these people ripping off the government and ripping off the community, and that's why they've made the rules so harsh, because I'm not doing that. But why would anyone do this to me? Why would I be being punished in this way if there weren't all these other people out there doing the wrong thing? And one of the things that I've really enjoyed about my work is seeing that the more we talk to folks about what's going on and some of those statistics around how many disabled people, how many people who are doing unpaid caring work are in the system, starting to realize that actually, yeah, they don't know anyone either who's a dole bludger, who's rorting the system. So that myth was invented in the 70s. And something important that happened in the 70s is we saw a very dramatic shift away from post-World War II policies around employment that had essentially meant people were unemployed for very short periods of time. There were lots of problems with full employment policies. So they were obviously built in a very patriarchal system where women were dependent on men, and they were expected to be dependent on men. There was this whole separate payment for women, and that's the origins of the partner income test that exists today that also needs to be gotten rid of. Partner and parental income tests, get rid of them. But we've got kind of this system that was breaking down, and the response to that was to say, well, we're going to have this thing called don't worry about the technical term actually, we're going to create unemployment. That'll solve our labour market problems. We're not going to get into that today. Hopefully you're all going to study economics as well. What that meant is they made a plan to have unemployed people. But they also needed to find a way to justify that. They needed to justify the fact that they no longer ensured people had a livable income. So they started to create myths that allowed people to be punished, because the community, again, started to think, who are these people ripping me off? I'm a hard worker, I pay my taxes. So all of that has kind of snowballed over decades now to where we are today, where we have this incredibly brutal poverty machine. We've got everything from the, you know, abhorrently low rate of payments to really niche parts of the system, like income control programs. You might have heard about the cashless debit card or the Indu card. And if you haven't yet, you're going to hear a lot more about it this election, because there's a lot of misinformation going on. So there's these really targeted things. That one's very, very racist, targeted at remote communities primarily. But then you've got this mutual obligation system that means depending on who you are and your circumstances, you've got all different kinds of hoops you have to jump through. And these hoops, as the government well knows, because all of the evidence shows, they don't help you get a job. So one of the studies that came out in the last couple of years was done over a very long period. I think off the top of my head, it was like a decade-long study, 6,000 people comparing long-term unemployed people who didn't have mutual obligations and long-term unemployed people who did have mutual obligations. And obviously this was an Australian study. And it found that if you did have mutual obligations, you took longer to get a job, you got a worse job, a lower paid job, and it lasted for a shorter period of time. So they're blocking people from getting work. And one of the programs that you've probably heard about that is the worst part of this system, or one of the very worst parts, is work for the dole. So you've got this kind of pyramid or hierarchy of activities, and they kind of put you in a boiling pot, right? When you start, you've got to go and have these pointless appointments with a job agency. I remember my most recent one, I haven't had to do mutual obligations for a few years myself, but I went in and tried to explain to this person from Serena Rosso that my previous job was reporting human rights violations. And she literally said to me, "What are human rights?" And I was like, how is this person going to help me get a job? Like, you know, you go in there and there's lots of different circumstances people are in. Some people have been given no education opportunities and actually need meaningful support. Other people like me know what I need, know what I'm capable of, do not need this paternalism. So we have people with all different needs being treated exactly the same way. When we do that, we're being kind of bullied, undermined. They have full control over your income, right? They can cut you off like that. So you kind of have to go along with their bullshit. I didn't check with Alana whether I can swear, but I'm assuming I can swear. Yeah, so you've got kind of this system that's cutting you down in all different ways. Once you're in it for about a year, this rule's about to change. You do this thing called work for the dole. Now, most people, fine, from what we hear, they're doing hard labor. They're doing things like maintaining cemeteries is a big one, it turns out, council showgrounds, lots of different community spaces that you probably see and enjoy all the time. And in fact, you probably see a lot of folks out there maintaining these spaces and you might not realize that they don't get paid, that they're living on half the poverty line, paying the cost of getting to that site themselves. They do get $20 travel allowance for a fortnight to cover that. So if you can get to a site 5 days a week for $10 a week, good luck. I think, you know, not even the cheapest public transport is going to help you do that. So we've got people doing this work of caring for our community, of creating value in our society, not getting paid for it. And you think, well, hang on, why is that happening? Aren't these jobs? And they are jobs and they should be paid, right? So it's really obvious that this ratcheting up of conditions over time have kind of normalized this idea that we should punish people for not having a job by forcing them to do work that they don't get paid for, but work that is necessary. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we do have people, and this is probably one of the most absurd examples I've had shared with me, is an older man, late 50s, sitting out the back of a church making jewelry out of plastic. And what happened with that jewelry is that it was sent over to Vietnam, to Saigon, and it was sold as local product to tourists. So it's just like, we're going to get a little more into like religious institutions and how they kind of profit from all this in a second. So you've got this kind of like idea that you don't want a job, you're at fault for not having a job, even though the government has planned to create unemployment, even though they make a choice to have hundreds of thousands of people in that situation. They force us to live in poverty and they force us to do these hamster wheel activities that have no value and get in our way. So basically we've got this fetishization of certain types of paid work, the devaluing and ignoring of unpaid work, culminating in this work for the dole program. And I just want to give, before I go into that kind of example of religious institutions, just one kind of thing that I think sums up the kind of scale of the problem that we're dealing with. This is from a survey that we recently conducted of disabled folks for a Senate inquiry. And we had this response from a young man who is a disabled teenager. He is homeless and he's been unable to get on the DSP. He said, "If I could claim job seeker, I would. except that living in the Kalgoorlie-Boulder area guarantees going onto the cashless debit card. The state has managed to demoralise us so totally that we would prefer to avoid the traumatising, violent experience of dealing with the government. So he is denying himself income support because he's afraid of income support, and he's homeless as a result. And he's trying to manage a disability. And as with so many parts of the system, of course, all of this is going to make his health worse. It's going to exacerbate his disability, and for many people, it creates disability. Again, one of the worst examples we have is a young man called Josh Parkthing, who died at the age of 18 at Toowoomba Showgrounds because of work for the dole and how it is set up and how unsafe it is. So we have this situation where, you know, everything's so clearly wrong, and surely we have to ask ourselves why. How are they getting away with it? And I guess the answer is there's a lot of people involved making a lot of money who also are benefiting from the system themselves. So I like to talk a bit about the poverty industrial complex, and the fact that we have these nominally good organisations and charities benefiting from things like work for the dole. They are the very organisations that have some of the most prominent roles in advocacy in the community. They're very strong community support. They are not only surviving and getting income from contracts through the government, they're also, for people's goodwill and desire to support people living in poverty, getting enormous amounts of direct donations from the public. So they're extracting wealth from the public through the tax and transfer system, and they're extracting it through direct contributions. So hopefully after this session, you'll be thinking a little more critically about these power structures and what's incentivizing the organisations to work the way they do. But they're kind of shamelessly taking advantage of these systems, and they don't have to. So, for example, we recently saw a PR boost for the government when they said Lifeline's getting $50 million. Isn't this great? We care so much about mental health. Now, the mental health think tank put out a report last year, which was great. They said, you know, the easiest thing the government could do to ameliorate mental health issues is overnight would be to increase the job seeker payment to the poverty line. Straightforward stuff. The government's not doing that. They're giving money to Lifeline. Lifeline's almost entirely staffed by unpaid workers, and they're not qualified counsellors. And not only that, some of them are even work for the dole participants. So recently heard from a woman who was recovering from radiotherapy, her cancer treatment, because she wasn't working, because she was recovering from radiotherapy. She was forced into work for the dole. She was, the activity that she ended up doing was answering the Lifeline crisis calls, and that then actually sent her to the point where she was incapable of working because of the psychological toll that took on her. So these organisations are seen as benevolent, but there's this fundamental problem. We've got firstly a fundamental problem where the existence of charities at all is a failure of government, but then the fact that the way this ecosystem has been created mean that these charities have an incentive to contribute to a variety of the worst parts of the system. So you've got the job agencies, they're the unemployment cops. Their job is to make sure they keep an eye on you, make sure you're doing all these activities the government forces on you. And if you don't do it, they're the ones who cut you off. Lots of these charities run job agencies. So if you've heard of Employment Plus, that's Salvo's. Lots of the others, they've got them too. Then they've got their charity shops where they take volunteers, and the volunteers tend to be older folks who are unemployed, which, you know, about 250,000 people over the age of 55 are on the job seeker payments. They're experiencing age discrimination in the workforce as well. So you've got people going and volunteering, staffing those stores, other more obscure things like running the Lifeline calls. And then you've got the work for the dole participants who tend to be in the more shitty work, like cleaning the warehouse and things like that. So we've got this whole business model, and I do call it a business model. I do not buy for a second that they're non-profits. They're extracting money, they're getting profits, and they are putting it to purposes that are not at all about helping the people they're exploiting. So they're using all this free labor, and then they redirect those funds into lots of different things that benefit the institution, but not the people. And I used to live in Cambodia, and I got to see this from the other side, right? So seeing some of these organizations, Australian charities that are complicit in this system, coming over there and doing evangelism in small communities where there's low levels of education, and essentially holding communities ransom by saying, we'll absolutely build you toilets, but we'll build you a church first. And then we'll give you all this kind of other aid. So you've got this money going from these Australian organizations into low-income countries as a recruitment exercise, essentially. So it's just like mad. It's mad and maddening. then we've got like the next layer, right? So there's all this advocacy going on around poverty in the social security system. There's an organisation called the Australian Council of Social Services, and they are kind of seen as the default people you go to if you're in the media or if you're in government or some other position of power and you want to talk about poverty. You go to ACOS. Now, the ACOS members are these very organisations that are actually implementing these systems. So there are for-profit agencies that are not non-profits, not considered charities, who do some of that work, and they're not ACOS members. But a lot of these organisations, Salvos is actually the worst offender of work for the dole. There are about 1,000 work for the dole sites, and like 280 of them are Salvation Army stores. So these organisations are getting all this money out of the system and controlling the advocacy because they are dominant in the kind of Council of Social Services group. So I'm like, unfortunately, not even getting to like touch the surface really here with that, with sort of what I'm sharing with you, but we've got all of this stuff working together as part of this poverty machine. You get the shame and stigma of being on payments is enough punishment alone, but then all of these things pile up on you. And you then, you know, we get to the point where some of you might have heard of my colleague, Jeremy Poxon. He's recently had to do work for the dole at Ballarat Cemetery. He went along to that site. 12 out of the 13 people there maintaining graves were disabled. And he asked them, do you know that you have rights? Do you know that you don't have to do this because for your health reasons, you don't have to be here? One guy got injured on Jeremy's first day on that site because the paid staff at the cemetery get to use ride-on mowers, but the work for the dole participants have to use push mowers. And the push mower, yeah, it's, sorry, I get a bit upset about it sometimes when I'm talking about it. The push mower like spat something out, a rock or something that hit him in the leg, gave him a leg injury. This guy's got kids. Jeremy said, you know, if you go to the doctor, you get a medical certificate, you don't have to do work for the dole. And he said, I'm just going to keep it warm because I know that if I try to get a medical exemption, I know I'm entitled to one, but I know that they will argue with me about it and I'm afraid that I will lose my payment even if I'm in the right. And this isn't just like anecdotal information, right? In 2019, a quarter of all payment suspensions were overturned because the job agency wrongly applied a suspension, either through a mistake or through not a mistake, being an asshole. So that's just one example. There's like an extraordinary number of the percentage of penalties applied to parents, primarily single mothers. In the Parents Next program, for example, the penalties are just always overturned because it turns out they didn't do anything wrong. The job agency is just used to having this ability to threaten and overburden people. Their incentive to do it is the amount they get paid for work for the dole and for other activities. I didn't even touch on that. If you host a group activity, you get $20,000 as an organisation. So you get free labour plus actual cash. If it's an individual, you get $1,000 for that individual. The job agency also gets money for placing a person in that work for the dole. So both sides are getting cash while the person can't afford to eat. So the person who's doing the work, you know. So we've got like very powerful, politically connected organizations that are able to get access to people like the Prime Minister. They're politically useful organizations for politicians because of that dole bludgeon myth, right? The government needs to be seen, the government needs to demonize unemployed people, but they balance that out with their like generosity and charity of helping these organizations who are apparently helping the unemployed people. So they're preying on the public support for people who, because the people do support unemployed folks, right? They're preying on that well-intentioned sentiment to kind of, you know, generate all of this ecosystem. So I will start to wrap up. I just wanted to briefly touch on hegemony and the Overton window. So I don't know if these are terms you guys have already been discussing, but obviously we've just got this normalization of all these things now. All of these factors have been in place pretty much since I was born in the 80s. Mutual obligations, work for the dole was originally, I think, proposed back in the 80s. I was just reading the other day a newspaper article with all of the various advocacy groups responding to a Bob Hawke announcement about it and just saying, this is going to be a disaster. And, you know, they literally just saw the future. We are where they predicted we'd be. So we've got lots of ways that we push back against this. We've got power in our language, power in our solidarity. Our campaign against work for the dole is kind of, I hope, going to prove a model for how we fight all different parts of this system. We're starting with a very comprehensive survey, talking to anyone who's been forced or coerced to do activities to get a payment, gathering all those inputs with a focus on work for the dole, but all those activities, and then using that to inform a whole range of things. Obviously, we want to do public communication, draw attention to this issue for people in the community. We want to talk to politicians, do lobbying, all that kind of stuff. But we also want to equip individuals with information about their own rights, because you do have rights in the social security system. You're just not told them because of all those financial incentives I talked about to keep people in situations they don't have to be in. To give people in the community tools and language to go and talk to their local government. Only local governments and charities can use work for the dole labour. So to go and talk to councillors and to say, hey, this is what's going on. I don't support it. And often these decisions are made by council staff, not by councillors themselves. So there really is, I think, a lot of political space for us to use our intelligence, our expertise in the system as people who are in it, with the support of people who are our allies, to push back against these things, because we know that changing the government's mind is hard. Both political parties support this program. As I just mentioned, Bob Hawke was the originator of some of these ideas. They have only gotten worse under both Liberal and Labor governments now for nearly 40 years. So we've got that avenue. We're not going to stop working on that, but we've got to enable and activate people in the system with a ring around them of people who aren't in it but support us, talking directly to their local government representative and making it untenable for their council to use these things. We've got to have people saying to charities at the end of the year when they do their Christmas appeal, I will not give you my money this year. I am not giving you my money because you are exploiting people. I'm not giving you money because of the way that people in the system that you profit from are treated. But I am going to give my money to this mutual aid organisation over here that's directly helping people, and saying to them, this is it. I'm not letting you get away with this. I'm going to name it. And naming it is really important. Language is so important. And I had a whole section on language that I was going to get into that I'm not going to. Maybe we'll get a chance in the questions. But there is this real, what I really wanted to make sure is clear, there's this real problem if your funding relies on poverty existing and you're the one who's then driving policy development and given a platform to talk about it. Even just the professional advocates, like, we don't get paid for our advocacy. We're all unpaid. We're living on payments. That's why we're experts. We know an awful lot more about this system than the people who design it. And I know that because I've been in government consultations with the people who design it. We're the ones who need to be centred. But at the end of the day, at the moment, we're being drowned out by these people. So there's a lot of strategies I've got here, maybe we can talk about around how we unravel all that. But yes, we've got a big, big task ahead of us. And yeah, I guess the final thing I want to say is from my colleague Maya Tsitsi. She's at Anglicare, one of the not hooked ones of these charities. And she said, governments can't shape attitudes on their own without political consensus. Consensus is critical, and much of the civil society doesn't see itself as part of that process. Many advocates and organisations instead see themselves as passive actors, reacting to shifts in opinion instead of shaping them, acting within what they assume is inevitable consensus. But there is no evidence that the current consensus is popular with the public. Its existence depends entirely on the fact that it hasn't been challenged. And so that's what I do every day. I challenge it.